At the beginning, there was only silence, not the empty kind, but the kind that breathes and watches, a silence that presses against the air, as if holding a secret waiting to be revealed. Within that stillness, life takes form. There is no noise, no explanation, only the invisible pulse of a God who gazes from eternity and decides to breathe again. From that breath, we were born. And in that same breath lie all the answers we've forgotten. Yet we never understand it, until something inside us breaks. The human soul seems to learn only through fracture. We live trying to control the course of our days, convinced that strength is born of will, until one day, something pulls the ground from beneath us, and we realize we were never owners, only guests. In that moment, breathing becomes conscious. Every inhale is an act of faith, a reminder that we are still here. We don't know why, but we remain. And that remaining, that decision to stay when everything seems lost, is already a prayer. Pain arrives without asking permission. It enters like a shadow that doesn't announce itself, and it fills everything. Sometimes it takes the shape of a word that cuts deep, a loss we can't explain, a dream collapsing right before our eyes. Life splits into a before and an after, and everything we were seems trapped at the edge of the abyss. We try to explain it. We try to believe there's logic, but suffering obeys no reason. It only leaves traces, and those traces lead to places we never expected to go. And when the wound opens, something deeper begins to speak. It isn't pain that destroys us. It's the voice behind it, the one that whispers, "You're not enough, God forgot you, your story is over." We believe it because it echoes the guilt we hide, the promises we broke, the fears buried beneath our masks of strength. But God, in His silence, has never left. He waits for the moment we stop listening to fear, so we can hear the truth again. There comes a moment when the soul loses its name and takes on the name of pain. It's when we stop saying, "I am afraid," and start saying, "I am fear." The wound ceases to be an event. It becomes identity. We walk beneath its shadow, unaware that we no longer breathe freely. But God is not afraid of the masks that pain gives us. He still sees who we are beneath them. Patiently, He waits for us to remember the name He gave us in the beginning, Beloved. The silence of God is not absence. It is presence in another language. When everything feels empty, He draws near quietly, like a breeze that doesn't need to prove anything. His love doesn't always make sense. Sometimes it feels like abandonment, but it's transformation. Because only in silence do we learn to hear what never fades. That inner voice that doesn't come from fear, but from hidden hope. And yet, in that process, doubt arrives. It slips in slowly, like water finding cracks. What if it was all an illusion? What if I've been speaking to nothing? Questions that seem dangerous, but in truth, they're seeds. A faith that was never questioned has never been alive. God doesn't fear our doubts. He prefers an honest uncertainty to an empty repetition. Every question becomes a door, and those who walk through it humbly discover that mystery doesn't separate us from God. It draws us closer. Some believe that falling is the end, but collapse can also be revelation. When everything crumbles, what was never meant to sustain us is exposed. What we once called stability was often just fear disguised as control. God, with tender severity, allows the fragile to break so the eternal can be seen, not to punish, but to free. The ruins are His workshop, the place where new roots begin to form. And among those ruins, when we look at ourselves unsure of who we are, the mirror lies. It reflects exhaustion, guilt, shame. But what it shows isn't truth. It's the shadow of what hasn't yet been restored. Learning to see with God's eyes is a slow task. It means finding beauty in the broken, strength in the fragile, purpose in what once looked like loss. The soul begins to heal when it stops believing the reflection and starts believing the promise. Waiting becomes the great lesson. Waiting when there are no signs, when hours are heavy and days bring no relief. Waiting is not punishment. It's the crucible where faith is refined. God is never late. He is precise. In His time, delays are not denials. They are divine exactness. Every day without an answer becomes ground where patience grows, that quiet virtue that doesn't shine but sustains. In the hidden classroom of suffering, God teaches without words. There, the soul learns the difference between strength and pride, between resignation and surrender. Every tear that falls becomes part of a conversation deeper than language. We discover that pain, when offered, stops being punishment and becomes a bridge. What was once a wound becomes compassion. What was once shadow becomes guidance. And just when we believe everything is lost, a light appears. Not a beam that chases away darkness, just a glimmer within it. Sometimes it comes through a gaze, a word, a memory. God has strange ways of entering the abyss, not to erase it immediately, but to remind us that even there, He can enter. From that point on, the soul stops seeking proof and starts seeking presence. It realizes that silence wasn't absence, it was accompaniment. God never left. He was waiting for us to stop demanding answers and start listening with the heart. When that understanding blooms, something changes. We no longer need to act, pretend, or convince. God doesn't look for performers. He looks for truth. His love doesn't depend on performance, but on surrender. In authenticity, faith stops being an effort and becomes rest. And in that rest, reconstruction begins. But it doesn't start outwardly. God rebuilds from within. He doesn't repair the old structure. He plants new roots. He gathers the scattered pieces of our story and arranges them into an order we never imagined. His rhythm is slow, but certain. He doesn't improvise. He creates. The soul starts to rise in small acts, a simple prayer, a written gratitude, a walk under the rain. Not grand gestures and faithful ones. Each opens space for hope. The miracle doesn't happen in a flash. It unfolds in constancy. Faith doesn't grow on easy days, but on days when we choose to believe without feeling. And when we least expect it, meaning returns. Not as explanation, but as certainty. Everything lived had purpose. Nothing was wasted. All became seed. God doesn't erase the past. He redeems it. Every fall becomes part of the design. Every loss a door to deeper truth. Then the wound stops hurting and begins to shine. The scar becomes testimony. What once brought shame now becomes a mark of life. God doesn't remove the marks. He fills them with light. Each one becomes a beacon that guides others. Proof that pain, too, can resurrect. And with that understanding, the language of faith transforms. It's no longer about asking, but about thanking. No longer about understanding, but trusting. Faith matures in tone and learns to speak softly. Where once there was complaint, there is now gratitude. Where once there was fear, now there is serenity. What follows is the slow miracle, the imperceptible change that one day finds us different without knowing when it happened. Life feels lighter, the soul clearer, the heart quieter. God works without noise, and in that silence, transformation becomes profound. Then comes forgiveness, not as concept but as freedom. To forgive the story is to release control, to let grace rewrite the meaning of the past. We can't change what happened, but we can change the weight it has on us. And when that weight falls, the soul breathes again. Everyday life starts to glow. Every detail becomes a reminder that God dwells in the simple, a kind word, a quiet afternoon, a ray of light on the skin. Life, in its most ordinary form, becomes the greatest temple. The voice of God, once sought outside, now lives within. It doesn't command, it inspires. It doesn't demand, it accompanies. His presence has become the atmosphere we breathe. The soul no longer fears losing Him, because it understands He was never gone. Then comes the invitation to begin again, not by denying the past, but redeeming it. God doesn't ask us to forget. He asks us to build upon grace. Every sunrise is proof that mercy is still open, that the story isn't over as long as there is breath. And when the soul begins to live again, its voice multiplies. What God healed in secret begins to heal others. Our story becomes a bridge, our voice a comfort. In the end, there is no end, only light. Not the kind that blinds, but the kind that dwells. The light of understanding, of peace that no longer depends on the world, of knowing that everything had meaning. What pain destroyed, grace rebuilt. And that light we once searched for outside now lives here, silent, constant, eternal. The restored soul no longer runs, it walks. Every step carries the weight of a prayer and the ease of a promise fulfilled in silence. It understands that time is no longer an enemy, but God's ally. The clock stops measuring loss and starts measuring process. Spiritual maturity is knowing that nothing comes late, because the eternal is never in a hurry. When life finds its rhythm again, new trials appear. Not as punishment, but reminders. God allows calm to be interrupted to test the depth of change. In those moments, the soul no longer complains. It observes. It knows that what comes will pass, and that peace doesn't depend on what happens, but on who remains. That's when we learn that true faith isn't avoiding storms, but walking through them without losing the direction of the divine wind. We think restoration is a place, but it's a movement. There's no point of arrival, only a new way of walking. Pain taught us to look inward. Grace teaches us to look outward. Now we see others with the eyes God used to see us, with compassion. We don't judge another's wound because we remember our own. In that empathy, spirituality becomes human, tangible, alive. There are days when the light feels faint, and yet it's enough. God doesn't ask for enthusiasm, only sincerity. Mature faith isn't measured by emotional intensity, but by the heart's perseverance when feeling nothing at all. Each dawn brings a quiet chance to choose trust again. And that choice, however small, moves invisible mountains. The healed soul learns to hear the language of the unseen. It knows that God's signs don't always come as miracles. Sometimes they're a calming thought, a guiding intuition, a gesture of unexpected love. Nothing is random to those who live awake in the divine. The ordinary becomes revelation. God doesn't speak only in temples. He speaks in street corners, in the small miracles only the attentive can see. And in that awareness, true worship begins. It's no longer about reciting words, but inhabiting presence. Prayer becomes breathing, work becomes service, rest becomes gratitude. Faith stops being part of life and becomes the way of living. Those who have walked through fire know there's no difference between sacred and ordinary, because God dwells in both. Still, life doesn't become perfect. There are days of weariness, nostalgia, questions unanswered. But the soul no longer fears emptiness. It lives with it as one lives with night. Knowing darkness doesn't cancel the sun, it only hides it. Pain never disappears entirely. It transforms into a reminder of dependence. And in that dependence lies freedom. Sometimes, looking back, tears return, not from sorrow but from gratitude. Every healed wound shines like a lighthouse, and the heart understands that what once felt like loss was preparation. God wastes nothing. Even the fragments become part of His design. Everything has meaning under His gaze, even what still hurts. The soul that has seen redemption grows quieter. It no longer needs to prove its faith or justify its hope. It lives with the certainty that the essential is not shown, it's radiated. Its presence becomes testimony. Wherever it goes, it carries peace, not because life is easy, but because the heart has learned the secret of contentment. God is enough. The slow miracle continues each day. It doesn't stop when stability arrives. It's a perpetual process of purification, of constant surrender. Every new challenge reveals a deeper layer of the soul. God keeps rebuilding even when we think we're complete. His love doesn't settle for enough. It reaches for fullness. Then comes the moment to share. What was once ruin becomes a word that builds. The voice that once cried now comforts. Telling the story no longer hurts. It heals. Testimony becomes an act of love, offering others the same hope that once held us. In that sharing, the story ceases to belong to us. It becomes God's tool. Souls touched by redemption recognize each other without words. There's a calm in their eyes, a tenderness in their gestures. They know what it means to lose everything and still keep loving. They are the true witnesses of the miracle. They don't preach with noise, they preach with presence. They don't impose faith, they embody it. And so, life rewrites itself without erasing. Each sunrise brings new pages, and the author remains the same. We no longer fear the future because we know it's woven by the same hands that held us in darkness. God's love isn't measured by good days but by His faithfulness in the gray ones. That love doesn't change when we fail, nor grow when we succeed. It simply is, constant, eternal, undeserved, but real. When the soul understands that, it stops asking for signs to believe. It starts believing to see. From that moment, everything simplifies. We no longer seek grand revelations but small reminders that we're still loved. Every honest gaze, every act of kindness, every mindful breath becomes liturgy. Life itself becomes prayer, and prayer becomes life. Silence returns, but now it sounds different, no longer empty but full. It's the space where the soul and God meet without words. In that silence, time loses weight, and fear loses meaning. Only presence remains. And in that presence, the certainty that there is no separation between the human and the divine. Then the final light begins to grow. It doesn't come from outside. It rises from within. It's the same light that sustained us when we couldn't see it. It illuminates memories, redeems shadows, gives meaning to waiting. It doesn't announce an ending, but a fullness. What once looked like ruin is now a temple. What was once loss is now a fulfilled promise. That is the final light, not the one that blinds, but the one that remains. Not the one that answers, but the one that abides. A light that no longer fears the night, because it learned to shine from within. A light that doesn't need to be seen to transform. And while the soul breathes, God smiles. Everything has returned to its place. Pain fulfilled its purpose. Faith matured. Hope never went out. What pain destroyed, grace rebuilt. And now that light, eternal, gentle, unending, lives here, in the heart that learned to love within the silence. The restored soul seeks no applause, no witnesses. It simply breathes. Each breath is a silent confession. I'm still here. I still am. What was once a plea is now gratitude. What was once fear is now rest. There is no urgency, only fullness. Words become unnecessary because experience has become enough. There is nothing left to prove because life itself has become testimony. God was never a visitor in pain. He was the architect of transformation. While I begged Him to pull me from the darkness, He was lighting it from within. While I cried for answers, He was weaving meaning through every invisible thread of my story. Nothing was lost. Nothing slipped from His hands. Every fragment served. Every silence spoke. Every delay was precision. Sometimes in the quiet of night I find myself smiling for no reason. Not because life is perfect, but because I finally understand I don't need to understand everything. Faith has replaced the need for control. What was once anxiety is now trust. The soul rests not because all is solved, but because it has found its center in the eternal. From that place, the gaze changes. I see beauty where I once saw ruin. I see purpose where I once saw punishment. All creation seems to breathe with me. Trees, wind, shadows, the distant sound of water. All singing in the same language, the language of the sacred. I discover there is no outside or inside of God. He is the space where everything happens. The soul then becomes prayer without words. Every simple act, a step, a gesture, a smile, bears the imprint of His presence. There is no separation between the spiritual and the everyday, between the divine and the human. Everything unites under the same light, and in that unity, existence regains its original purity. There is no return to the past. It has been absorbed by grace. There is no fear of the future. It belongs to the same love that held the yesterday. Only the present remains, that eternal instant where God becomes tangible. Eternity is not a later moment. It's here, in every conscious and grateful breath. Sometimes I close my eyes and return to the beginning, to the silence where it all started. But now, it's no longer a silence of emptiness, it's one of presence. I hear the same breath that gave me life, the same that sustained me when I wanted to give up. I realize the journey was never outward, but inward, toward that point where my soul and God recognize themselves as a single breath. Time, with its relentless passing, no longer frightens me. I know that what is true remains. The superficial dissolves, the essential endures. The soul no longer fears loss. It understands that every loss is a way of returning to what matters. There is no end for those touched by eternity. And when I look at others, I see the reflection of the same story. Every person carries an invisible battle, an unanswered prayer, a wound God is still transforming. I don't need words to understand, only compassion. Love has become my theology, and empathy my worship. I've learned heaven isn't somewhere else. It's in the eyes of forgiveness, in the hands that serve,